Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey to the English countryside in the small hours of an August morning in 1963 to a railway bridge in Buckinghamshire where 15 men stopped a train carrying a fortune, executed what seemed like the perfect crime, and sparked the largest manhunt in British history. We travel to understand not just how they did it, but why this particular robbery captured the public imagination, how meticulous planning gave way to careless mistakes, and how what began as criminal genius ended in capture, imprisonment, and lives destroyed by the consequences of a single night's work. But before we board that mail train in the darkness, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us journey to Britain in 1963, to a time when a train could be stopped and robbed with nothing more than coloured lights and determination, when criminals could become celebrities, when a single night's work could change dozens of lives forever. Imagine yourself standing beside the railway tracks in the Buckinghamshire countryside on the night of August 7th into the 8th, 1963. It's just past 3 in the morning. The night is mild for August in England, temperatures around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable, almost pleasant if you weren't doing something illegal. The sky is overcast, clouds obscuring the moon and stars. This darkness is deliberate, planned for. The gang waited for a night without moonlight, a night when they could work in near total darkness. You're standing near Bridego Bridge, a railway bridge in a rural area about 30 miles northwest of London. This spot was chosen carefully. It's remote. The nearest village, Cheddington, is a mile away. The nearest house is out of sight. At 3 in the morning, nobody should be around to witness what's about to happen. Listen to the sounds. Wind in the trees, this is farming country, fields and hedgerows and scattered woodlands. An owl calling from somewhere nearby. The rustle of leaves, your own breathing, your heart beating faster than normal because you know what's coming. Know that the next 15 minutes will either make you rich or land you in prison for decades. And then, faintly at first, you hear it. The diesel locomotive, the up special travelling post office, running its regular route from Glasgow to London Euston Station, right on schedule, approaching at about 60 miles per hour. Picture the train as it comes closer. The locomotive, a diesel engine, not steam anymore. This is 1963, and Britain's railways are modernising. Behind the engine, 12 coaches. Most carry mail being sorted by postal workers, even as the train moves. But the second coach, the high-value package coach, called the HVP coach, carries something different, something extraordinary. Money. Over £2.5 million in used banknotes. Cash being transported from Scottish banks to the Bank of England in London. This is routine. Such shipments happen regularly, keeping Britain's banking system functioning. But this particular shipment, on this particular night, has become the target of the most carefully planned robbery in British criminal history. The locomotive's headlight cuts through the darkness. The sound grows louder, the deep rumble of the diesel engine, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. You can feel the vibration in the ground as the train approaches. It's moving fast, too fast to stop quickly. The gang knows this, which is why they've done what they've done to the signals ahead. Before we witness the robbery itself, we need to understand the Britain of 1963. Because this wasn't just any robbery, it was a crime that captured the nation's imagination precisely because of who committed it, when they committed it, and what it said about British society at a particular moment in history. Imagine Britain in the early 1960s. Picture the transformation. The Second World War ended 18 years ago, but its effects still shape everything. Rationing only ended in 1954, less than a decade ago. Many adults still remember queuing for bread, for meat, for sugar, still remember bomb damage in cities, still remember loss and sacrifice and hardship that lasted years beyond the war's end. But by 1963, Britain is changing rapidly. The economy is booming. Employment is nearly full. Almost everyone who wants work can find it. Wages are rising. Consumer goods that were luxuries in the 1940s are becoming common: televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, even cars for working-class families. Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, famously said in 1957 that Britons never had it so good, and by 1963, that assessment seems accurate for many people. The class system is changing too. Not disappearing. Britain is still deeply class-conscious, still divided between working class, middle class, and upper class, with accent and education and occupation marking these divisions clearly. But the boundaries are becoming more porous. Working-class kids are going to university in unprecedented numbers. Rock and roll and youth culture are challenging old hierarchies. The Beatles will release their first album in 1963, heralding a cultural transformation that will make the 1960s legendary. Crime is changing as well. Traditional British crime was small-scale, local, often almost genteel. Burglaries, shoplifting, bar fights, pickpocketing, the occasional bank robbery, usually bungled, usually ending quickly in arrest. Professional criminals existed, but operated on modest scales, stealing what they could carry, fencing goods for fractions of their value, accepting limited rewards and limited risks. But a new type of criminal is emerging in 1960s Britain, more organized, more ambitious, more willing to plan complex operations requiring coordination, specialized skills, significant investment in equipment and preparation. These criminals study their targets, rehearse their operations, operate almost like businesses, and they're succeeding, pulling off robberies that yield unprecedented amounts of money. The Great Train Robbery will be the apex of this trend, the most ambitious robbery yet attempted in Britain, the most meticulously planned, the most spectacularly successful, and the most famous, capturing headlines worldwide, making its perpetrators into folk heroes for some, into symbols of everything wrong with modern Britain for others. Imagine the world Bruce Reynolds, Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, and the others inhabited. These weren't desperate men driven to crime by poverty. Most were actually doing reasonably well by working-class standards. They had homes, families, legitimate jobs, some of them. But they also had ambitions that legitimate work couldn't satisfy. They wanted money, lots of money, enough to live like wealthy men, to have the material comforts and status that British society said they shouldn't aspire to given their class backgrounds. The criminal underworld in London and the South East had its own structure, its own hierarchies, its own code of behaviour. There were specialist men who could crack safes, men who could drive getaway cars, men who could fence stolen goods, men who could provide alibis and cover stories. Professional criminals knew each other, worked together on various jobs, trusted each other within limits, though that trust was always conditional, always subject to the pressures that might make someone inform to save themselves. Violence was part of this world, but governed by rules. You didn't hurt ordinary citizens unnecessarily that brought too much police attention. You didn't inform on colleagues. That was the ultimate betrayal, punishable by ostracism or worse. You accepted that arrest and prison were occupational hazards, part of the business, something you dealt with stoically when your turn came. And the rewards could be substantial. A successful robbery might yield thousands of pounds, enough to live well for months or years, enough to invest in legitimate businesses, enough to send children to better schools and move to nicer neighbourhoods. The risks were real, prison sentences were severe if you were caught, but the potential rewards made those risks acceptable to men with the temperament and skills for this work. Reynolds, who would mastermind the train robbery, epitomised this new type of criminal. He was intelligent, well-read, thoughtful. He studied robberies, like a military commander studies battles, analysing what worked, what failed, what techniques could be adapted and improved. He assembled teams based on skills needed for specific jobs. He invested time and money in reconnaissance, in planning, in acquiring proper equipment. He approached crime professionally, methodically, treating it as a business that required expertise and preparation to succeed. And he was audacious. Most criminals stuck to modest targets: jewelry stores, bank branches, payroll deliveries where the potential take was thousands or tens of thousands of pounds. Reynolds thought bigger. He looked for opportunities that might yield hundreds of thousands. And when he learned about the mail trains carrying huge shipments of cash, he began thinking about an opportunity that might yield millions. The idea that would become the Great Train Robbery was born from this intersection of ambition, opportunity, and professional expertise. Reynolds would spend months researching, planning, assembling his team. What happened on the night of August 8th would be the result of extraordinary preparation meeting extraordinary ambition, and the consequences would exceed anything Reynolds or his gang imagined. To understand the Great Train Robbery, we must first understand Britain in 1963, a nation caught between its past and its future, still bearing the marks of the Second World War that had ended 18 years earlier, but beginning to experience the cultural and social changes that would transform it into something quite different. Britain in 1963 was still, in many ways, the Britain of the immediate post-war period. Rationing had only ended in the 1950s. The physical scars of bombing remained visible in British cities, with bomb sites still awaiting redevelopment. The economy, while improving, was still recovering from the massive expenditure of the war and the loss of empire that had defined Britain's wealth and power for centuries. The class system remained rigid in ways that would seem extraordinary to modern observers. The upper-class aristocracy and landed gentry still held enormous social prestige and economic power, though their political power was waning. The middle class was expanding as more people received education and entered professional occupations. And the working class, the miners, factory workers, dock workers, railway workers, remained a distinct social category, living in working-class neighborhoods, attending working-class schools, working working-class jobs with limited prospects for upward mobility. This class structure was not just economic but cultural. People spoke differently depending on their class. Accents and vocabulary immediately identified someone's social position. People dressed differently, ate differently, had different expectations about what their lives would be. The rigid formality of British social relations, the deference shown to superiors, the consciousness of one's place in the social hierarchy, all of this was still largely intact in 1963, though it would begin to break down as the decade progressed. The economy was changing. Manufacturing remained the backbone of British employment, but it was beginning to decline in the face of international competition. The coal industry, which had employed millions, was contracting as Britain shifted toward oil and natural gas. The docks, which had been the lifeblood of a maritime trading empire, were modernizing with containers, eliminating thousands of traditional dock worker jobs. Unemployment was relatively low by later standards but rising, and many working-class communities were experiencing economic insecurity. Against this economic uncertainty, there was also opportunity. Education was expanding. The 1944 Education Act had created a system of free secondary education, and more working-class children were receiving grammar school educations that could lead to university and professional careers. The National Health Service, created in 1948, provided free medical care, dramatically improving health outcomes for poor families. A welfare state existed, providing a safety net that previous generations had lacked. Culturally, Britain in 1963 stood at a threshold. The social conservatism of the 1950s was beginning to give way to something more permissive, more youth-oriented, more rebellious. The Beatles had released their first album in March 1963 and were in the process of transforming popular music. The first James Bond film, Dr. No, had been released in 1962, creating a new kind of British cultural icon, suave, violent, sexually liberated, utterly unlike the restrained British gentlemen of earlier generations. But in August 1963, these changes were still nascent. Britain was still a country of deference and formality, of BBC announcers speaking in received pronunciation, of pubs closing at 10:30, of Sunday as a day when almost nothing was open. It was a country where homosexuality was still illegal, where divorce was difficult and socially stigmatizing, where women were expected to give up careers upon marriage, where abortion was illegal and contraception difficult to obtain. Crime in Britain was relatively low by later standards, but rising. The post-war years had seen an increase in property crime, burglary, theft, robbery. Violent crime was less common but also increasing. The criminal underworld in London and other major cities was organised, but not in the way American organised crime was organised. There was no British mafia, no hierarchical criminal organisations with clear structures and territories. Instead, there were gangs, loose associations of criminals who worked together on specific jobs, who knew each other through prison or neighbourhood connections, who could be assembled for particular criminal enterprises and then dispersed afterward. These criminals came overwhelmingly from working-class backgrounds. They were men who had grown up in poverty, who had left school at 14 or 15 with minimal education, who had limited legitimate opportunities for advancement. Some turned to crime opportunistically, stealing to supplement inadequate incomes. Others made crime a profession, developing expertise in particular criminal specialties, safecracking, burglary, armed robbery. The police in 1963 were very different from modern British police. There were no computers, no DNA analysis, no CCTV cameras. Detective work relied on informants, on physical evidence like fingerprints and footprints, on patient investigation and interviews. The Metropolitan Police in London Scotland Yard was considered one of the world's premier police forces, with a strong tradition of professionalism and a reputation for incorruptibility that was largely deserved, though not entirely accurate. Prisons were harsh. Long sentences for serious crimes were common. Prisoners lived in austere conditions, with hard labour, minimal amenities, and strict discipline. The death penalty still existed for murder, though it would be abolished in 1965. The threat of long imprisonment was real and was supposed to deter serious crime. Whether it actually deterred is debatable, but criminals certainly knew that if caught, they would face severe consequences. The railway system in 1963 was in transition. British Railways, nationalised after the war, was struggling financially. The Beeching Report, published in March 1963, recommended closing thousands of miles of railway lines and thousands of stations to cut costs. The romantic age of steam was ending. Diesel locomotives were increasingly replacing steam engines, and the diesel locomotive that would pull the train robbed on August 8th was representative of this modernisation. Trains were still crucial for mail delivery. The travelling post office trains were moving sorting offices, where postal workers sorted mail while the train travelled between major cities. The system was efficient. Mail posted in Glasgow in the evening could be delivered in London the next morning. These trains carried ordinary mail and also registered mail, parcels, and high-value packages, including currency being transported between banks. The security for these trains was minimal by modern standards. The mail coaches had locks and were watched by postal workers, but there were no guards, no armed protection, no sophisticated alarm systems. The trains travelled on schedules that were publicly available. The routes were fixed and predictable. Anyone who studied the system could learn everything needed to plan a robbery: what trains carried valuable cargo, when they ran, what routes they followed, where they might be vulnerable. The money being carried on the UP Special TPO on the night of August 7th-8th was being transported as part of the normal functioning of Britain's banking system. Scottish banks accumulated English currency from customers and businesses, and this currency needed to be returned to the Bank of England in London. Similarly, Scottish currency was transported north. This was routine, happening regularly, carrying amounts that varied but were always substantial. On this particular night, The amount was larger than usual, over £2.5 million, equivalent to perhaps 50 to 70 million pounds in current value, or roughly $75 to $90 million. The exact amount would not be known until after the robbery, when the banks could inventory what had been taken. But the gang that planned the robbery knew that the train regularly carried large amounts, and they had intelligence from sources they never revealed that this particular train would be especially valuable. The rural area where they planned to stop the train, Buckinghamshire, about 40 miles northwest of London, was an unlikely setting for major crime. This was farming country, with small villages, isolated cottages, narrow country lanes. The railway line ran through this countryside, connecting the industrial cities of the north to London, passing through rural peace on its way to the capital. The specific location chosen for the robbery was a railway bridge near the village of Cheddington. The bridge crossed a country lane called Bridego Bridge. It was isolated, invisible from nearby houses, accessible by country roads, yet close enough to London that getaway would be relatively quick. The gang would force the train to stop at a signal before the bridge, then uncouple the engine and the first two coaches, the high-value package coach and one other, and drive them forward onto the bridge, where the unloading would occur away from the rest of the train and its crew. This location had been carefully selected after reconnaissance. The gang had driven the roads, timed the journey from the bridge to their intended hideout, ensured that the route was viable for trucks carrying heavy loads of stolen money. They had studied the signal system, understanding how to manipulate it to stop the train. They had observed the train on previous nights, noting its speed, its configuration, the number of crew members visible. Everything had been planned with meticulous care, and on the night of August 7th, 1963, everything was in place. The men were assembled, the vehicles ready, the hideout prepared. At 3:03 in the morning, the train would approach the signal at Sears Crossing, and history would be made. But before we follow the events of that night, we must understand who these men were, how they came together for this extraordinary criminal enterprise, and how months of planning produced the operation that would become Britain's most famous robbery. Let's understand how the robbery was planned, because the planning stage is fascinating, a study in criminal intelligence, in problem solving, in the meticulous preparation that made the crime possible. The gang didn't just wake up one morning and decide to rob a train. They spent months researching, preparing, acquiring what they needed, rehearsing their roles. Picture Bruce Reynolds in the months before August 1963, working on the problem. How do you rob a moving train? Several challenges present themselves immediately. First, you need to stop the train. Trains don't stop except at stations or for signals. Stopping one on open track requires either causing it to crash unacceptable because people would die and the locomotive might be destroyed, making the crime impractical, or tricking the driver into stopping by manipulating the signals. This means understanding how railway signals work, obtaining the right coloured lights and power sources, positioning your false signals where the driver will obey them. Second, you need to separate the target coach from the rest of the train. The cash is in the high-value package coach, the second coach behind the locomotive. The other coaches carry mail and postal workers, dozens of men who might interfere if they realise what's happening. So you need to uncouple the HVP coach from the rest of the train and move it forward, away from the postal workers, before beginning the robbery proper. Third, you need to control the train crew and the postal workers in the HVP coach. The driver and fireman must be prevented from interfering or signalling for help. The 5 postal workers in the HVP coach, armed with nothing but courage because British postal workers don't carry weapons, must be subdued quickly, before they can destroy the money or alert authorities. Fourth, you need to unload the money quickly. The mail train carries hundreds of mail bags, but only some contain cash. The gang needs to know which bags to take, needs enough men to carry them from the train to getaway vehicles, needs to work fast because every minute at the crime scene increases the risk of discovery. Fifth, You need somewhere to go afterward. Can't drive directly to London, too obvious, too risky. Need a nearby hideout where the gang can lie low while the initial police dragnet sweeps the area, where they can divide the money, where they can plan their next moves. Reynolds worked on each problem methodically. For stopping the train, he recruited an insider, someone with knowledge of railway operations who could advise on how signals worked and where best to stop a train. For controlling the crew, he recruited men with experience in physical intimidation, but also crucially tried to recruit a train driver who could move the locomotive forward after it stopped. This last recruitment failed, forcing the gang to improvise on the night, with nearly disastrous consequences. For the hideout, they found Leatherslade Farm, a remote farmhouse, about 27 miles from the robbery site, isolated, accessible by back roads, large enough to house 15 men, perfect for their needs. They rented it using a false name, paying cash, telling the owner they needed it for a legitimate business venture. For reconnaissance, gang members repeatedly traveled the route, observing the train's schedule, timing its runs, surveying potential stopping points. They chose Bridego Bridge because the terrain suited their needs. The track was straight, approaching the bridge, giving the driver good visibility of signals, and the bridge itself would provide cover for their vehicles. Think about the level of preparation this required. Months of work by numerous people. Significant financial investment in equipment, rental properties, vehicles. The risk that someone might talk, that police might learn about the plan before it could be executed. The coordination required to bring together specialists with different skills, personalities, levels of criminal experience. And yet Reynolds managed it. Assembled his team, acquired what was needed, rehearsed the operation. By early August 1963, everything was ready. The gang was in place at Leatherslade Farm. The signals were prepared. The vehicles were positioned. All that remained was executing the plan. The Great Train Robbery was not a spontaneous crime. It was the product of months of planning, careful selection of personnel, acquisition of equipment and vehicles, rehearsal of procedures, and reconnaissance of the target. Understanding how this planning occurred, who was involved, and how they organized themselves is crucial to understanding both the robbery's success and its ultimate failure. The exact origins of the plan are disputed, as various participants would later claim credit or deny responsibility, depending on whether they were trying to enhance their criminal reputations or minimize their sentences. But the general outline is clear. In late 1962 or early 1963, several London criminals began discussing the possibility of robbing one of the travelling post office trains that carried cash between cities. The criminal underworld in London at this time was a network of men who knew each other through prison, through growing up in the same working-class neighbourhoods, through previous criminal enterprises. These were not sophisticated crime bosses in the American sense. They were working-class men, many with violent criminal records, who supplemented or replaced legitimate income through theft. They robbed banks, burglarized businesses, stole goods for resale. They drank in the same pubs, lived in the same neighborhoods, knew each other's families. One of the central figures in the early planning was a man named Bruce Reynolds. Reynolds was in his early 30s, a career criminal who specialized in planning and executing robberies. He was considered intelligent, methodical, good at organizing complex operations. He had contacts throughout London's criminal underworld and could assemble teams for specific jobs. Another key figure was Gordon Goody, who had been involved in a previous mail train robbery and knew something about how the system worked. There was also Buster Edwards, Charlie Wilson, Tommy Wisby, and others' names that would become famous in the aftermath of the robbery, but at the time they were simply professional criminals looking for a score large enough to retire on. The challenge they faced was immense. Stopping a moving train without causing a derailment required technical knowledge they didn't possess. Controlling the train crew and unloading heavy mail bags in a short time required manpower and coordination. Getting away with the money required vehicles and a secure place to hide until the immediate manhunt died down. And all of this had to be done without leaving evidence that would lead police back to them. The first problem, stopping the train, required someone with railway knowledge. The gang recruited a man they called the Ulsterman, who supposedly knew about railway signalling systems and could explain how to force a train to stop. His identity has never been definitively established, and some have questioned whether he existed at all or whether his role was exaggerated. But somehow, the gang learned what they needed to know: that trains respond to colored light signals, that covering a green light and substituting a red light would cause a driver to stop, that signals could be manipulated with relative ease if you knew what you were doing. The location was critical. They needed a place where the train ran slowly enough that tampering with signals wouldn't cause suspicion, where the track was straight enough that the driver would see the signal in time to stop safely, where the location was isolated enough that they could work without being observed, and where access roads allowed vehicles to approach and depart without being seen from any populated areas. After extensive reconnaissance, they selected Sears Crossing, near the village of Cheddington in Buckinghamshire. The location met all their criteria. The signal was simple to access, the track was straight, the area was deeply rural, and country lanes provided access without requiring travel through villages where they might be remembered. Next, they needed a place to hide after the robbery. The plan was not to flee immediately to London or to disperse. That would be obvious and expected. Instead, they would hide nearby, wait for the initial intensive manhunt to focus elsewhere, and then gradually move the money and themselves back to London when police attention had shifted. They found Leatherslade Farm, a remote property about 27 miles from the robbery site. The farm was being sold, and they arranged through intermediaries to rent it for a period, paying in cash, using false identities. The farm was isolated, approached by a long lane, invisible from main roads. It had outbuildings where vehicles and money could be hidden, and it could accommodate 15 men for the time they needed to wait before dispersing. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but complex in execution. They would tamper with the signal at Sears Crossing to show red, forcing the train to stop. They would overwhelm any resistance from the train crew through numbers and threat of violence. They would uncouple the engine and the first two coaches from the rest of the train, move forward onto Bridego Bridge, and there unload the mail bags from the high-value package coach into waiting vehicles. They would then drive to Leatherslade Farm, count and divide the money, and wait at the farm for several days before departing separately back to London. Assembling the team required recruiting men with specific skills and temperaments. They needed someone who could handle the train driver and operate the locomotive. This proved problematic, as we shall see. Men strong enough to unload heavy mail bags quickly. Men capable of controlling the train crew without excessive violence. They wanted to avoid murder charges. Drivers for the getaway vehicles. Men who could be trusted to remain calm under pressure and not to talk afterward. The final gang numbered 15 men, though not all participants have been definitively identified even decades later. Some of the known members included Bruce Reynolds, considered the mastermind, the organizer who brought the team together and coordinated the planning. He was in his early 30s, intelligent, organized, and experienced in planning complex robberies. Gordon Goody, experienced in mail train robbery, he contributed knowledge about how the system worked. He was physically imposing, useful for intimidating the train crew. Buster Edwards, a close associate of Reynolds, involved in the planning and execution. He was a florist when not engaged in criminal activity, and his combination of legitimate business and crime was typical of the gang's members. Charlie Wilson, another experienced criminal, he would play a role in managing the operation at the robbery site and later at the farm hideout. Ronnie Biggs, perhaps the most famous gang member due to his later escape and life as a fugitive, but actually one of the least important participants in the robbery itself. Biggs's main contribution was recruiting a train driver who could operate the locomotive, though this recruit would fail at the crucial moment. Tommy Wisby, a career criminal with experience in various forms of theft. He participated in the robbery and would later be caught and sentenced. Roy James, a racing driver, recruited because his driving skills might be useful in getaway. He participated in the robbery and the dividing of money at the farm. Roger Caudry. He had some knowledge of railway signals and may have been involved in tampering with the signal system, and others, some whose identities were never firmly established, some who managed to avoid capture, some who were caught but whose specific roles remained unclear. The recruitment was done carefully through trusted intermediaries. No one wanted to involve anyone who might be a police informant or who might panic and give the game away. Each man was assessed for his reliability, his criminal competence, and his ability to keep silent afterward, and each was promised a share of the take that would be large enough to retire on hundreds of thousands of pounds for each participant. The equipment they needed was acquired over months. They needed vehicles, several Land Rovers and trucks capable of carrying heavy loads, all purchased with cash, all eventually traced by police. Tools, equipment for tampering with signals, crowbars for forcing open the train coach, gloves, balaclavas, supplies for the hideout, food, drink, bedding for 15 men staying several days, communications, walkie-talkies for coordinating between the signal location and the bridge. All of this had to be acquired without attracting attention, without creating a paper trail that could be traced. They used intermediaries, paid cash, gave false names, and tried to ensure that no one could connect the equipment purchases to the individuals who would use them. The rehearsals were limited. They couldn't actually practice stopping a train, but they went through the motions, timing how long it would take to unload mail bags, practicing moving vehicles in convoy, ensuring everyone understood their role. The plan called for military precision, with each man knowing exactly what he should be doing at each stage of the operation. The intelligence about which trains carried how much money came from a source the gang never revealed. There were rumors that someone inside the postal service or banking system had provided information, but no such person was ever identified. It's possible the gang simply observed trains over time, noting which ones seemed to be carrying the most security, or which ones postal workers treated with unusual care. Or they may have had an insider who was never caught, or who was protected by the gang's silence. By early August 1963, everything was ready. The signal equipment had been tested. The vehicles were in place. Leatherslade Farm had been stocked with supplies. The men had been briefed on their roles. They knew that the up-special TPO on the night of August 7th-8th would be carrying a substantial amount of cash. They had reconnoitred the route from the robbery site to the farm multiple times. They had discussed contingencies, what to do if the train didn't stop, if there was more resistance from the crew than expected, if police appeared. The plan they had developed was the most ambitious train robbery ever attempted in Britain. Previous mail train robberies had been smaller, less organised, less brazen. This operation would involve stopping a moving train in the countryside, overpowering its crew, unloading over 100 mail bags in 15 minutes, and escaping with what they believed might be £1 million or more. If successful, it would be the crime of the century. If it failed, they all faced long prison sentences. On the evening of August 7th, the gang members began assembling at Leatherslade Farm. Some arrived in the afternoon, others in early evening. They waited through the daylight hours, tense, probably drinking, though they had been warned to stay relatively sober, checking and rechecking their equipment, going over the plan one more time. As darkness fell, they loaded into the vehicles, Land Rovers, and a truck that would carry the stolen mail bags. They drove to positions near Sears Crossing, parking where the vehicles wouldn't be seen from the road. A small team went to the signal to prepare it, covering the green lens with a glove, rigging a red light powered by batteries to show red when the train approached. And they waited. The night was mild, with clouds obscuring the moon, perfect conditions for what they planned. The countryside was silent except for night sounds. No traffic passed on the country lanes. It was just after 3 in the morning, the deadest hour of the night, when most people are asleep and when reaction times are slowest. At 3:03 a.m., they heard the diesel engine of the approaching train. Everything they had planned for months would now be tested in the next 15 minutes, and nothing would go exactly as planned. Let's slow down and understand exactly what happened during those 15 minutes. Because the execution of the robbery, despite being meticulously planned, involved improvisation, mistakes, and a moment of violence that would haunt everyone involved. Imagine this moment precisely. 3:15 a.m. The train driver, Jack Mills, sees the signals ahead. The distant signal, the advance warning signal, shows yellow, meaning caution. Next signal might be red. This is unusual but not unprecedented. Signals sometimes show caution for various legitimate reasons. Maintenance work ahead, another train on the same section of track, equipment malfunction. Mills reduces speed from about 60 miles per hour to perhaps 30, approaching cautiously. Then the home signal, the signal that directly controls whether the train can proceed, shows red. Stop. Full stop. This is more concerning. A red signal here, in the middle of nowhere, at 3 in the morning? Mills doesn't know what's ahead. Could be anything. But signals are absolute. Red means stop. Every railway worker knows this. Violating a red signal can mean dismissal, can cause accidents. Mills applies the brakes. The train begins slowing. Picture what's happening in the gang's minds at this moment. They're watching from concealment near the track. They see the train approaching, see it beginning to slow, see the headlight drawing closer. The signal plan is working. The train is going to stop exactly where they need it to. But they're also nervous. Even experienced criminals get nervous before major crimes. 15 men waiting in darkness, knowing that in minutes they'll either be rich or arrested, or possibly dead if something goes catastrophically wrong. Hearts beating fast, adrenaline coursing, muscles tense, waiting for the moment when action replaces planning. 3:17 a.m. The train stops. The locomotive is positioned almost perfectly just past Bridego Bridge, exactly where the gang wanted it. Mills and his fireman, David Whitby, look ahead, trying to see why the signal is red. They see nothing. The track ahead appears clear. No maintenance work, no obvious obstruction. Whitby climbs down from the cab to check. He's following protocol. When a signal shows red unexpectedly, you investigate. As soon as Whitby is on the ground, gang members rush him. 6 or 7 men appear from the darkness. They're wearing masks, gloves, carrying improvised weapons. They grab Whitby, overpower him quickly. He's outnumbered and surprised, doesn't even try to fight. They take him back to the locomotive cab. Mills is still in the cab, trying to understand what's happening. Through the cab windows, he sees masked men approaching. Before he can react, they're climbing into the cab. One man, Buster Edwards, shouts at Mills, "Get down, get on the floor." Mills hesitates. He's confused, frightened, trying to process the situation. And then, one of the gang members who exactly has never been definitively established strikes Mills on the head. This blow changes everything. The gang had planned a robbery, not an assault. They needed to control the train crew but weren't supposed to hurt them. Violence brings severe legal consequences in Britain. Robbery with violence carries much longer sentences than simple robbery. But someone panicked, or lost control, or decided that force was necessary to ensure Mills's compliance. The blow wasn't severe enough to render Mills unconscious, but hurt him badly, leaving him dazed and bleeding. This moment, this single blow will haunt the robbery forever. Jack Mills will suffer lasting effects from this injury. He'll never fully recover, will die 7 years later, with many believing the robbery shortened his life. Public sympathy for the robbers will evaporate when this violence becomes known, and the courts will impose extraordinarily severe sentences partly because of what happened to Jack Mills. But in the moment, the gang has other priorities. They need Mills to move the locomotive forward, to separate the HVP coach from the rest of the train. They have a retired train driver with them, someone they recruited specifically for this task, but he's unfamiliar with diesel locomotives, can't figure out the controls. So they force Mills, injured and frightened, to drive the train forward half a mile, taking the HVP coach away from the rest of the train where postal workers in other coaches might interfere. 3:25 a.m. The locomotive and HVP coach are stopped at the designated spot. Other gang members have already broken into the HVP coach. 5 postal workers were inside, sorting mail. They're quickly overwhelmed 15 masked men with crowbars and koshes against 5 unarmed postal workers. No contest. The postal workers are ordered to lie on the floor. They comply. They're terrified but unharmed. Now begins the frantic work of unloading the money. The HVP coach contains 128 mail bags. Some contain cash, some contain routine mail. The gang doesn't have time to check every bag, they just start throwing bags out of the train, forming a human chain passing bags from the coach to the waiting vehicles. The bags are heavy, some weigh 40 or 50 pounds, full of bundles of banknotes. The work is exhausting, the pace frantic. 3:40 a.m. Approximately 15 minutes since the train stopped. The gang has loaded their vehicles with over 100 mail bags. They have no idea exactly how much money. They've taken no time to count, barely time to load. But they know it's a fortune. Multiple vehicles, Land Rovers and trucks are loaded to capacity. Time to go. Time to get away before police arrive. They leave. The vehicles drive away into the darkness, following pre-planned routes to Leatherslade farm. Behind them, they leave Jack Mills bleeding in the locomotive cab, David Whitby and the 5 postal workers shaken but unharmed in the HVP coach, and a train stopped in the middle of the Buckinghamshire countryside, with its cargo stolen. 15 minutes. That's all it took. 15 minutes to execute what had taken months to plan. 15 minutes that would make criminal history. 15 minutes that would lead to the largest manhunt in British history, to trials and escapes, and decades of consequences for everyone involved. The great train robbery was over, but its story was just beginning. The Up Special travelling post office train departed Glasgow Central Station on the evening of August 7th, 1963, on its regular overnight run to London Euston. It consisted of a diesel locomotive and 12 coaches, including the second coach behind the engine, designated the high-value package coach, where registered mail, parcels, and secure deliveries were stored. On this particular night, that coach contained approximately 128 mail bags, many of them filled with used banknotes being transported from Scottish banks to the Bank of England. The train crew numbered 75 postal workers, who sorted mail in the other coaches, while the train travelled south through the night. In the high-value package coach were 5 workers, responsible for the secure cargo. In the locomotive were the driver, Jack Mills, age 57, and his second-man assistant, David Whitby, age 26. Mills was an experienced railway worker who had driven trains for many years. He was within a few years of retirement, a family man, quiet and professional. Whitby was younger, less experienced, but learning the job. Neither man had any reason to expect that this night would be different from hundreds of other nights running the same route. The train proceeded south through the darkness, keeping to its schedule, making its planned stops. At Carlisle, at Preston, at Crewe, more mail was loaded and postal workers continued their sorting work. By 3 a.m, the train was in Buckinghamshire, about 40 miles from its destination in London. The route from here was straight and fast, through the rural countryside, with few stops. Mills would have been looking forward to reaching Euston around 4 a.m, ending his shift, going home to his wife and family. At approximately 3:03 a.m, as the train approached Sears Crossing near Cheddington, Mills saw that the signal ahead was showing amber caution, prepare to stop. This was not unusual. He reduced speed as procedures required. As he came closer to the next signal, dwarf signal number 706, he saw it was showing red. Stop. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Signals sometimes showed red due to malfunctions or because another train ahead was using the same section of track or for various other operational reasons. Mills brought the train to a stop, as required. His second man, Whitby, climbed down from the locomotive to go to the signal telephone box, which would allow him to contact the signalman to ask why the signal was red and how long they would be delayed. But as Whitby walked toward the telephone box, men appeared from the darkness. They were wearing balaclavas, carrying weapons, not guns, but koshes and crowbars. They grabbed Whitby, told him to keep quiet, and walked him back toward the locomotive. Whitby, shocked and frightened, complied. At the locomotive, Mills was still at the controls, waiting for his second man to return with information about the signal. He saw men climbing onto the locomotive, saw his second man being brought back under guard, and realized instantly that this was a robbery. Before he could react, the men were in the cab, one of them striking Mills on the head with a kosh, knocking him down. Mills fought back briefly but was overwhelmed by numbers. The blow to Mills's head caused significant injury. He suffered a head wound that bled heavily, and possibly a concussion. This injury would have long-term consequences for Mills, and would later become significant in terms of the charges the robbers faced. The gang had planned to use intimidation and minimal violence, wanting to avoid murder or serious assault charges. But in the chaos of the moment, someone identity never firmly established hit Mills harder than intended. With the driver and secondman subdued and controlled, the gang now faced their first serious problem. Their plan required moving the locomotive and the first two coaches forward about half a mile to Bridego Bridge, where the unloading would occur. They had recruited a man who claimed he could drive a diesel locomotive, but when this man, never firmly identified, tried to operate the controls, he couldn't do it. The diesel locomotive was more complex than he had anticipated, or he panicked, or he simply didn't have the knowledge he had claimed. This created a crisis. The gang had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes before their absence from the farm or their presence at the signal might be noticed, before some random event might bring someone to investigate, before their window of opportunity closed. They needed to move the train, and the only person who could do it was Jack Mills, injured and bleeding from the blow to his head. Under threat and duress, Mills was forced to operate the locomotive. He was told that if he didn't cooperate, he would be hurt further, or his second man would be hurt. Bleeding, in pain, probably concussed, Mills drove the locomotive forward as directed, uncoupling from the rest of the train, pulling only the locomotive and the first two coaches toward Bridego Bridge. This was later remembered as an act of considerable courage and presence of mind. Mills, injured and frightened, still operated the train safely, not attempting any heroic resistance that might have caused a wreck or injuries to others, but also not cooperating more than minimally necessary. His actions probably prevented worse violence and certainly prevented a potential disaster. At Bridego Bridge, the locomotive stopped. The gang now had access to the high-value package coach, but it was locked. The 5 postal workers inside, having felt the train stop and then partially move forward, knew something was wrong, but didn't know what. They heard shouting outside, heard crowbars attacking the door. The gang smashed through the side door of the coach, entering with overwhelming force. The 5 postal workers, unarmed and untrained for such situations, were quickly controlled. They were told to lie on the floor, not to move, not to look at the robbers. Obeying probably saved them from injury. The gang wanted no witnesses who could identify them, and keeping the workers' faces down prevented them from seeing anything useful to police. Now began the most physically demanding part of the robbery, unloading the mailbags. Each bag weighed approximately 56 pounds, filled with bundles of banknotes. There were approximately 128 bags to be moved from the coach to the truck waiting on the lane below the bridge. This required carrying each bag from the coach down from the railway embankment to the waiting vehicle repeated 128 times in as short a time as possible. The gang formed a human chain, passing bags from man to man, loading them into the truck. This was exhausting physical labor, and 15 minutes into the operation, men were tiring, moving more slowly, making more noise. They were also becoming more nervous as time passed. Every minute increased the risk that someone might notice the stopped train, that police might appear, that something might go wrong, but nothing went wrong. The countryside remained silent. No police appeared. No random witness drove past and noticed the activity. In about 15 minutes, all 128 bags had been transferred to the truck. The gang members scrambled into their vehicles, Land Rovers for personnel, the truck for the money, and departed, leaving the train, its crew, and the rest of the mail behind. Mills and Whitby, still under guard in the locomotive, were tied up but not seriously harmed further. The postal workers in the high-value package coach were also restrained. As the sound of the vehicles faded, the train crew began working to free themselves and to raise the alarm. The gang drove through the night countryside following their planned route to Leatherslade farm. They had done it. They had stopped a moving train, overcome the crew, stolen an enormous amount of money, and escaped. In their vehicles was over £2.5 million, far more than they had anticipated, a sum so large they would have difficulty counting it, much less spending it safely. They reached Leatherslade farm sometime around 4 a.m. Exhausted from adrenaline and physical labor, they unloaded the mailbags into the farm buildings and finally allowed themselves to celebrate. They had pulled off what seemed like the perfect crime. The money was secured. They were safely hidden. The plan had worked. But the plan, despite its apparent success, contained the seeds of its own failure. And in the days that followed, as they counted the money and waited at the farm before dispersing, they made a series of mistakes that would lead Scotland Yard's detectives directly to them. The attack on Jack Mills had been the first mistake using more violence than necessary, creating a victim whose injury would generate public sympathy and police determination to catch those responsible. But there were other mistakes, made at the farm, that would prove equally fatal to their freedom. Back at the train, Mills and Whitby had freed themselves and raised the alarm by about 4:30 a.m. The first police arrived at the scene soon after. By dawn, the railway line was closed and preserved as a crime scene. Scotland Yard was notified, and the investigation began that would become one of the most intensive manhunts in British criminal history. Detective Superintendent Malcolm Futrell of the Buckinghamshire Constabulary received the first report of the train robbery in the early hours of August 8th. As the most serious crime ever committed in his jurisdiction, indeed, one of the largest robberies in British history, the investigation immediately became a top priority. By mid-morning, Scotland Yard's flying squad had arrived from London to take over, bringing resources and expertise that the local constabulary lacked. The flying squad was an elite unit within the Metropolitan Police, specializing in robbery and serious crime. Its detectives were experienced, well connected with informants in London's criminal underworld, and accustomed to high-profile investigations. The man who would lead the investigation was Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper, though several other senior detectives would play crucial roles, including Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler, who would become obsessed with the case and pursue it for years. The crime scene told a story that experienced detectives could read. At Sears Crossing, they found the signal that had been tampered with, the green lens covered with a glove, a battery-powered red light rigged to show red. This immediately told them several things. The robbers had technical knowledge about railway signals, they had planned carefully, and they had conducted reconnaissance of this specific location. At Bridego Bridge, the scene was more informative. The side door of the high-value package coach had been forced open with crowbars, leaving tool marks that might match to specific tools if those tools were recovered. The ground showed tyre tracks from multiple vehicles, several Land Rovers, and at least one larger truck. These tracks could be photographed and potentially matched to specific vehicles. Most importantly, the bridge and the surrounding area contained fingerprints. The robbers had worn gloves during the robbery itself, but not all of them had been careful about everything they touched. A paint can, used possibly for some purpose during the robbery, had fingerprints. The truck's tailgate had partial prints. The area contained dozens of potential fingerprint sources, and Detective Sergeant Maurice Ray and his team began the painstaking work of lifting and preserving every print they could find. Fingerprints in 1963 were the gold standard of forensic evidence. If a suspect had been arrested previously, his fingerprints would be on file at Scotland Yard. The technology for comparing prints was slow. Each print had to be manually examined and compared to filed prints using visual inspection and classification systems, but it was reliable. If they could identify even one gang member through fingerprints, that person might lead them to the others. The investigation also needed witnesses. The police appealed for anyone who had seen anything unusual in the area, vehicles being driven on country roads in the early morning hours, men behaving suspiciously, trucks carrying loads in the middle of the night. They interviewed residents of nearby villages, asking if anyone had noticed anything out of the ordinary in the days or weeks before the robbery. These inquiries produced some useful information. Several people remembered seeing Land Rovers and a truck on the country roads near Cheddington in the days before the robbery. Some remembered the vehicles being parked in odd places, as though the drivers were watching something or waiting for something. These reports helped confirm that the robbery had been carefully planned with extensive reconnaissance. The police also had to consider the question of how the gang knew that this particular train would be carrying an unusually large amount of cash. This suggested either inside information, someone within the postal service or banking system who had tipped them off, or careful long-term surveillance of the trains to identify patterns. The police quietly investigated postal workers and bank employees who might have had access to information about cash shipments, but this line of inquiry produced nothing definitive. The injured train driver, Jack Mills, was interviewed extensively. He described the attack, the men he had briefly seen before being struck, the fact that they wore balaclavas and spoke with London accents. He couldn't identify anyone, the disguises and the brief contact made that impossible, but his account helped establish the sequence of events and the approximate number of men involved. The postal workers from the high-value package coach provided similar accounts. They had seen men in balaclavas, had been forced to lie face down, had heard but not seen much of what occurred. Their inability to identify anyone was frustrating but not surprising. The gang had been careful about preventing identification. By the afternoon of August 8th, less than 12 hours after the robbery, the investigation had established several key facts. The robbery involved at least 15 men, based on witness accounts and the logistics required. The men were professional criminals, likely from London, based on their accents and the sophistication of the operation. They had conducted careful reconnaissance and planning over an extended period. They had used multiple vehicles, including Land Rovers and a truck. They had left fingerprints at the scene, which might identify them if they had criminal records. They had caused serious injury to Jack Mills, which meant they faced charges of robbery with violence, carrying long prison sentences. What the police did not know was where the gang had gone or where they were hiding. The immediate assumption was that they had fled to London, dispersing into the anonymity of the city's working-class neighbourhoods. A manhunt was launched in London, with police watching known criminals, interviewing informants, searching for any sign of the stolen money or the vehicles used in the robbery. But the gang was not in London. They were still at Leatherslade Farm, less than 30 miles from the robbery site, counting and dividing the money. The farm must have been a scene of celebration and tension. The money, when counted, totaled £2,631,684 over £2.5 million, far more than they had expected. Divided among 15 men, Each share came to over £150,000, a fortune in 1963, equivalent to several million pounds in current value. But handling this much cash presented problems. The bills were used currency, in various denominations, bundled and wrapped, but requiring careful counting. The physical volume was substantial. Millions of pounds in cash fills many sacks and weighs hundreds of pounds. And the serial numbers of at least some bills would be recorded by banks, making the cash potentially traceable if spent carelessly. The gang's plan called for staying at the farm for several days, waiting for the initial intensive police activity to focus elsewhere, then departing separately with their shares. But staying at the farm required caution. They had to avoid being seen. They had to avoid creating evidence that could connect them to the farm. They had to be careful. Despite instructions to wear gloves at all times while at the farm, the men became careless. They touched surfaces without gloves, leaving fingerprints on bottles, glasses, plates, furniture, door handles, window sills. They played Monopoly to pass the time, handling the game board and pieces without gloves, leaving fingerprints all over the game. They ate meals, drank, smoked, touched things constantly, each touch potentially leaving prints. They also left other evidence. They brought to the farm various items from their homes, sleeping bags, personal effects, a radio. Some of these items were marked with names or had receipts that could be traced. They left behind food packaging, cigarette butts, newspapers purchased in London that could potentially be traced to specific shops. The original plan called for burning the farm before they left, destroying all evidence. But when the time came to leave after 5 days at the farm, by which time they had counted and divided the money and felt that police attention had shifted to London, they decided not to burn it. Perhaps they thought burning would attract attention. Perhaps they believed they had been careful enough that no evidence remained. Perhaps they simply made a bad decision in the moment. On August 12th and 13th, the gang members departed Leatherslade farm separately, each carrying his share of the money, driving different vehicles, heading to different locations. They left behind the farm buildings, the vehicles used in the robbery, and an enormous amount of forensic evidence that would lead police directly to them. For 3 days, the farm sat empty, and then, on August 13th, a farm worker named John Maris, who lived near Leatherslade farm, became curious about activity he had noticed at the property. He knew the farm had been sold and thought it was empty, but he had seen vehicles coming and going, and he wondered what was happening. On August 13th, he decided to investigate. He found the farm buildings open, seemingly abandoned. Inside, he found vehicles, mail sacks, and various signs of recent occupation. He immediately contacted the police, reporting his discovery. And at that moment, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Let's understand how the police investigation worked, because catching the train robbers required not just following evidence but coordinating the largest manhunt in British history, processing unprecedented amounts of information, and using cutting-edge forensic techniques for 1963. Imagine the pressure on the investigators. Picture Detective Superintendent Malcolm Futrell and his team in the hours and days after the robbery. They're facing enormous pressure. This is the biggest robbery in British history. The newspapers are running huge headlines. The public is simultaneously scandalized and fascinated. The government wants arrests. The railroad wants security restored. And the police have very little to go on initially. The crime scene itself yields some evidence, but not much. Tire tracks near Bridego Bridge. Footprints. The tampered signals carefully examined, photographed, studied for any fingerprints or identifying marks. The mailbags left behind, some scattered near the track, some still in the HVP coach. These are catalogued, checked for any evidence the robbers might have left. But the robbers were careful during the crime itself. They wore gloves. They wore masks. They didn't speak more than necessary, no distinctive voices or accents for witnesses to remember. The postal workers who were in the HVP coach could describe the attackers' general build and behavior, but not their faces or any identifying features. Jack Mills and David Whitby, traumatized by the attack, provided similar vague descriptions. Imagine the detective work required. The police know several things from the crime scene analysis. First, this was meticulously planned. The signal tampering required knowledge of railway systems. The timing hitting the train at exactly the right place required reconnaissance. The speed of execution indicated rehearsal. This wasn't random criminals getting lucky. This was a professional operation. Second, the gang was large. Witnesses estimated at least 15 men. That's a big group, meaning either a well-established criminal network or multiple smaller groups working together. Either way, someone in London's criminal underworld probably knows something. Third, they needed vehicles, multiple vehicles, to carry away over 100 mailbags. Those vehicles had to be hidden somewhere nearby immediately after the robbery. You can't drive through the British countryside at 4 in the morning in a convoy of loaded trucks without attracting attention unless you have somewhere close to go. Fourth, they needed a hideout. You don't divide over £2 million by the roadside. You need somewhere secure, somewhere private, somewhere you can count money and plan next moves without interruption. And carrying that much cash requires time. You can't just stuff it in suitcases and scatter. There's the logistics of division, of deciding shares, of planning how to launder or spend such a massive amount. Futrell reasons through these facts. The hideout can't be far from the robbery site. Maybe 20 miles, 30 at most. Any farther and the risk of being spotted travelling through the countryside with loaded vehicles becomes too great. So the police begin searching, checking every farm, every remote house, every property within a 30-mile radius that might serve as a hideout. They also begin working their informants. Police in London, in the areas where professional criminals live, start asking questions, putting pressure on known criminals, making it clear that information about this robbery will be well rewarded, emphasizing that whoever did this will be caught eventually, so cooperating early might be wise. And they wait for mistakes, because criminals always make mistakes eventually. Maybe someone spends stolen money carelessly, maybe someone talks when drunk, maybe physical evidence surfaces, maybe internal disputes lead to informants. The police know that patient, methodical investigation usually yields results if you're thorough and persistent. Within days, the investigation gets its breakthrough. Not through brilliant detective work initially, but through simple persistence, a postman noticing an unusual property. Leatherslade Farm, where strangers seem to be staying. Police investigate. Find evidence everywhere. The case breaks open. But even with Leatherslade Farm discovered, identifying specific individuals takes work. The fingerprints must be matched to known criminals, a process that in 1963 requires manual comparison using card files, not computer databases. Detectives spend weeks going through files, matching prints, building cases against specific individuals, and then arrests begin. One by one, gang members are identified, located, arrested. Some surrender quietly, some try to run, some attempt elaborate alibis that quickly collapse under questioning. Within months, most of the gang is in custody. The investigation becomes a template for how to handle major crimes, coordinate different police forces, use forensic evidence systematically, follow money trails, work informants, be patient but relentless. Scotland Yard's success, in this case, will influence British policing for decades. Detective Superintendent Malcolm Futrell arrived at Leatherslade Farm on the afternoon of August 13th, 5 days after the robbery. In response to John Maris's report, what he found was a detective's dream, a crime scene preserved with evidence throughout, left behind by criminals who had been careless or overconfident, or both. The farm buildings contained the vehicles used in the robbery, 3 Land Rovers and a truck, all purchased with cash, all eventually traceable through vehicle registration records and purchase documentation. The Land Rovers showed signs of hard use, with scratches and dents consistent with cross-country driving. The truck still had a few mail sacks in its bed, left behind in the haste of departure. Inside the farmhouse, Futrell found evidence of extended occupation. The kitchen contained food scraps, empty bottles, dirty dishes. The bedrooms showed signs of multiple people sleeping there, mattresses on floors, sleeping bags, personal items. The living areas were littered with newspapers, magazines, cigarette butts, and miscellaneous trash. And everywhere, on every surface, in every room, there were fingerprints. The gang had clearly tried to be careful initially, but over 5 days of living in the space, they had become careless or tired of the discipline of constantly wearing gloves. They had touched bottles while drinking, glasses while pouring, plates while eating, door handles while moving through the house, windowsills while looking out, furniture while sitting and moving things. Most damning was a Monopoly game found in the farmhouse. The board and pieces were covered with fingerprints, clear, usable prints that would later be matched to multiple gang members. The image of criminals playing Monopoly while waiting to escape with their stolen millions would become one of the iconic details of the case, representing the strange combination of ordinary domesticity and extraordinary crime. Futrell immediately recognized the significance of the discovery. This was not just a hideout, it was a preserved crime scene that would allow forensic experts to identify the criminals with certainty, assuming those criminals had fingerprints on file. He secured the scene, called for additional investigators, and initiated the careful process of documenting and collecting evidence. Detective Sergeant Maurice Ray and his fingerprint team descended on the farm and spent days systematically lifting prints from every surface. They found usable prints on bottles and drinking glasses in the kitchen, plates and cutlery, door handles and light switches, window sills and window frames, furniture including tables, chairs, and bed frames, the Monopoly game board and pieces, a ketchup bottle, this became particularly famous as one of the clearest prints, various other household items. In total, they lifted hundreds of fingerprints, many of which were clear enough for comparison with filed prints at Scotland Yard. This painstaking work took days, but it was work that would solve the case. The vehicles were also examined carefully. Registration numbers were traced to their owners, who were then interviewed. Most had sold the vehicles for cash to men who gave false names, but the sellers could provide descriptions, and some remembered details about the buyers that would prove useful. The vehicles themselves contained more fingerprints, fiber evidence, and other traces that connected them to both the robbery site and to specific individuals. The farm's rental history was investigated. The property had been rented by individuals using false names, paying cash through intermediaries. But the intermediaries could be traced and interviewed, and gradually the chain of arrangements that led to the gang's rental of the farm could be reconstructed. Scotland Yard now had a massive amount of evidence, but they needed to process it systematically. The fingerprint analysis was top priority. Each lifted print had to be photographed, classified according to the standard fingerprint classification system, which categorized prints by the patterns of ridges and halls, and then compared to the files at Scotland Yard containing fingerprints of known criminals. This was before computers, before automated fingerprint identification systems, before digital databases. The comparison was done by hand, by experienced fingerprint examiners who looked at prints through magnifying glasses, comparing the ridge patterns and minutiae, the specific points where ridges end or fork, to determine matches. It was slow, exacting work, requiring patience and expertise. But it worked. One by one, fingerprints from Leatherslade Farm were matched to individuals with criminal records. The first match came quickly within days of lifting the prints. A partial print from a paint can found at Bridego Bridge was matched to Gordon Goody. This single match immediately confirmed that the farm was connected to the robbery and that Goody, a known London criminal, was involved. More matches followed rapidly. Charlie Wilson's prints were found on a windowsill. Bruce Reynolds's prints were on a bottle. Ronnie Biggs's prints were on a ketchup bottle. Roy James's prints were on a plate. Tommy Wisby's prints were on a cupboard handle. One by one, the gang members were identified through the careless fingerprints they had left at the farm. Not all gang members were identified immediately through fingerprints. Some had been more careful, or their prints were unclear, or they had no previous criminal records and therefore no prints on file. But the investigators now had names, and names led to known associates, to addresses, to places where suspects might be found. Scotland Yard launched a series of simultaneous raids, arresting gang members before they could flee or hide. The arrests began in mid-August, less than 2 weeks after the robbery, and continued through the fall as investigators tracked down those who had gone into hiding. Roger Caudry was arrested on August 14th in Bournemouth, where he was staying in a hotel with his share of the money hidden in his room. The discovery of large amounts of cash confirmed his involvement and provided additional evidence. Charlie Wilson was arrested at his home in London on August 22nd. Police found £40,000 hidden in his house, part of his share from the robbery. His fingerprints from Leatherslade farm placed him at the scene, and the money confirmed his participation. Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, and Bob Welch were arrested in various locations in late August and early September as fingerprint matches identified them and investigators tracked them down. Gordon Goody was arrested on September 3rd at his home in Putney. Police found no money. Goody had hidden his share elsewhere, but his fingerprints from the paint can at the bridge made his guilt clear. Roy James was arrested on August 29th. Police found £12,000 at his address, part of his share. His fingerprints at the farm confirmed his involvement. Ronnie Biggs was arrested on September 4th. His fingerprints on the ketchup bottle at Leatherslade farm were among the clearest found at the scene, making it impossible for him to deny being there. Other arrests followed as the investigation continued. In total, 12 men were charged with robbery and related offences. Not all 15 participants were caught. Some managed to escape abroad before arrests could be made. Some were never definitively identified. Some may have had involvement that couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The two most important gang members remained at large: Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards, both considered masterminds of the operation, both aware that they were wanted, both in hiding. They would evade capture for years, their absence fueling speculation about where they were and whether they would ever be brought to justice. The speed and success of the investigation impressed the public and the press. From the discovery of Leatherslade farm on August 13th to the majority of arrests by early September, the police had worked with remarkable efficiency. The credit belonged largely to the fingerprint evidence. The gang's carelessness at the farm had undone all their careful planning. But catching the criminals was only the beginning. The Crown now had to prove in court that these men had committed the robbery, had to present the evidence in a way that would convince a jury, had to secure convictions and sentences that would reflect the seriousness of the crime. The money, meanwhile, had largely disappeared. Police recovered some cash during the arrests, tens of thousands of pounds found in homes and hiding places, but the vast majority of the £2.5 million was gone, hidden or spent or moved to places police could not find. This would remain one of the frustrating aspects of the case. The gang had been caught, but they had hidden the proceeds successfully enough that the money was never fully recovered. The next stage of the process was the legal machinery of prosecution committal hearings to determine if there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, then the trial itself, where the accused would face the evidence against them and where their fates would be decided by a jury of ordinary citizens who would judge whether they were guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The trial would become one of the most famous in British legal history, closely followed by the press, watched by a public fascinated by the audacity of the crime and the drama of seeing the criminals brought to justice. The trial of the Great Train Robbery Gang began at Aylesbury Crown Court in January 1964, 5 months after the robbery. The trial was held at Aylesbury rather than London because the crime had occurred in Buckinghamshire, and local jurisdiction applied. The courtroom was packed with press, public, and relatives of the accused. Outside, Crowds gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of the defendants as they were transported to and from court. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General himself, an unusual step that demonstrated the government's determination to secure convictions and exemplary sentences. The case against the defendants was built primarily on forensic evidence, the fingerprints from Leatherslade Farm and Bridego Bridge, that placed specific individuals at the crime scenes. 12 men stood trial: Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson, Ronnie Biggs, Tommy Wisby, Roy James, Jim Hussey, Bob Welch, Roger Caudry, Leonard Field, William Bowl, John Daly. Robert Wilson later determined to have been wrongly accused and his conviction overturned. Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards remained at large and would be tried separately when captured years later. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the fingerprint evidence. Expert witnesses explained how fingerprints are unique to each individual, how the prints from Leatherslade Farm matched the defendant's prints on file, how the scientific certainty of fingerprint identification meant there was no doubt that these men had been at the farm. The ketchup bottle with Biggs's prints, the paint can with Goody's prints, the various household items with other defendants' prints. Each piece of evidence was presented, photographed, and explained. The physical evidence from the farm, the vehicles used in the robbery, traced through registration and purchase records to the defendants or their associates. The mail sacks found at the farm, proven to have come from the robbed train. The equipment used to tamper with signals, showing planning and technical knowledge. The money recovered. Cash found during searches of defendants' homes in amounts that proved possession of proceeds from the robbery. The serial numbers of some notes matched those known to have been on the train. Witness testimony. The train crew, particularly Jack Mills and David Whitby, testified about the attack. Postal workers described the robbery. Police officers explained the investigation, the discovery of the farm, the arrests. Forensic evidence. Expert witnesses testified about tire tracks, tool marks, and other physical evidence linking the defendants to the crime scenes. The defense faced an impossible task. The evidence against most defendants was overwhelming. Their fingerprints placed them at the farm where robbery proceeds were found and vehicles used in the robbery were stored. The timeline was clear. The forensic evidence solid. The witnesses credible. Some defendants claimed they had never been to Leatherslade Farm, that the fingerprints must have been planted or mistaken. But this defense was implausible. Fingerprint evidence was too well established, too respected by juries, too scientifically sound to be dismissed as error or fabrication. Others claimed they had been at the farm but didn't know it was connected to the robbery, that they had visited for innocent reasons and happened to leave fingerprints. But this defense required juries to believe in extraordinary coincidences, that multiple men with criminal records had innocently visited a farm that was used as a hideout for a major robbery, touching items connected to the crime without knowing anything about it. A few defendants had stronger defenses. John Daly, whose fingerprints were found on the Monopoly game, argued that he had visited the farm innocently and didn't participate in the robbery. The jury found insufficient evidence to convict him, and he was acquitted. Robert Wilson, initially convicted, later had his conviction overturned when it was determined that the evidence against him was insufficient and that he had been wrongly accused based on mistaken identity and weak circumstantial evidence. But for most defendants, the evidence was too strong to overcome. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with the jury hearing dozens of witnesses and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence. The proceedings were thorough, professional, and conducted with the formality characteristic of British criminal justice. On March 26, 1964, the jury returned guilty verdicts for most of the defendants. The exceptions were Daly, acquitted, and a few others, where evidence was deemed insufficient for conviction. The sentencing occurred in April 1964, and this is where the case became controversial and remains so to this day. The sentences handed down were extraordinarily harsh, reflecting several factors. The seriousness of the crime. The robbery had stolen a massive amount of money, had stopped a train through force, had involved careful planning showing criminal sophistication. The injury to Jack Mills. Mills had been struck on the head, suffering a wound that required stitches and a concussion. The long-term effects would plague him for the rest of his life. This injury elevated the charge to robbery with violence, which carried much harsher penalties than robbery alone. Deterrence. The judge made clear that he intended the sentences to deter others from attempting similar crimes, to send a message that spectacular robberies would be punished with spectacular sentences. Public pressure. The case had attracted enormous media attention. The public demanded that the criminals be punished severely. The judge was aware of this pressure and may have been influenced by it, consciously or unconsciously. The sentences pronounced were shocking even to observers who expected harsh punishment. 30 years for most of the principal defendants: Charlie Wilson, Gordon Goody, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Roy James, and others. 30 years for Ronnie Biggs, despite his relatively minor role in the actual robbery. 25 years for some defendants judged to have played lesser roles. Shorter sentences of 14 to 20 years for those whose involvement was less direct. 30 years was, at that time, one of the longest sentences ever imposed for a non-murder crime in Britain. It was longer than many murderers received. It was longer than the sentences for rape, for other serious violent crimes, for most offences except the gravest. The severity sparked immediate debate. Critics argued the sentences were disproportionate, that they reflected class bias, working-class criminals being punished more harshly than white-collar criminals who stole comparable amounts through fraud. They noted that the violence in the robbery was limited to a single blow to one person, terrible but not murder or attempted murder. They questioned whether deterrence worked, whether long sentences prevented crime or simply warehoused criminals at public expense. Supporters argued the sentences were appropriate given the planning, the organisation, the brazenness of the crime, and the injury to Mills. They emphasised that the robbery represented a direct challenge to social order, an attack on the systems of commerce and security that society depended on. They believed harsh sentences were necessary to prevent copycat crimes and to demonstrate that major criminality would be met with overwhelming response. The debate continues decades later. Were the sentences just or excessive? Was 30 years for robbery appropriate or a miscarriage of justice in its own way? Should criminals be judged by the amount stolen and the violence used, or should other factors, age, rehabilitation potential, proportionality to other crimes, matter more? These questions have no simple answers. But the Great Train robbery sentences became a landmark in British criminal justice, cited in debates about sentencing philosophy, about the purposes of imprisonment, about justice and mercy. For the convicted men, the sentences meant that most of their adult lives would be spent in prison. Men in their 30s would be elderly if they served full terms. Families would be destroyed. Children would grow up with fathers in prison. Wives would face decades of supporting households alone, visiting husbands in grim Victorian prisons, dealing with the stigma and practical hardships of having a convicted criminal as a spouse. The money, meanwhile, was mostly gone. Police had recovered only a fraction of the stolen £2.5 million. The rest was hidden, spent, moved abroad, or otherwise made unreachable. The gang members, facing decades in prison, refused to reveal where the money was, perhaps hoping to use it upon release, perhaps protecting associates who had helped hide it, perhaps simply maintaining criminal honour by not cooperating with authorities. Some gang members accepted their sentences and began serving their time with as much dignity as they could muster. Others, however, began planning escapes, unwilling to accept decades in prison, determined to get out by any means necessary. And this is where the story takes another dramatic turn, because two of the most famous events in the Great Train robbery saga were not the crime itself, or even the trial, but the spectacular prison escapes that followed. Charlie Wilson was serving his 30-year sentence at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham when, on August 12, 1964, barely 4 months after his conviction, he simply disappeared. Or rather, he didn't disappear, he escaped, aided by accomplices outside the prison who used a ladder to scale the wall, broke into the prison, overpowered a guard, and freed Wilson, who climbed back over the wall with them and fled into the night. The escape was audacious and embarrassing to the prison service. A convicted train robber, one of the most carefully watched prisoners in Britain, had simply been taken out of prison by his friends. The escape demonstrated that even after capture and conviction, the train robbers remained capable of spectacular actions. Wilson fled to France, then to Mexico, then to Canada, living as a fugitive with his family, using false identities, constantly aware that British and international police were searching for him. He lived this way for 4 years, until 1968, when he was finally located in Canada and extradited back to Britain to continue serving his sentence. But Wilson's escape was only a prelude to the most famous prison escape in British criminal history: the escape of Ronnie Biggs. Biggs was serving his 30-year sentence at Wandsworth Prison in London, one of Britain's most secure facilities. But on July 8, 1965, 15 months after his conviction, Biggs escaped in an operation that was both absurdly simple and brilliantly executed. A furniture van pulled up outside the prison wall at a predetermined time. Men inside the van erected a ladder against the wall. Inside the prison, Biggs and 3 other inmates created a distraction, then ran to the wall where the ladder had appeared, climbed it, jumped into the van, and were driven away before guards could react. The entire escape took minutes. Biggs was driven to a safe house where he underwent plastic surgery to change his appearance, a painful process that altered his face enough to make recognition more difficult. He then fled to Europe, travelling through France, Spain, and eventually to Australia, using false passports and identities. In Australia, Biggs lived under an assumed name for several years, working, raising his family, trying to build a normal life. But in 1969, British police, acting on a tip, located him in Melbourne. They initiated extradition proceedings, and Biggs, aware that capture was imminent, fled again, this time to Brazil. Brazil would become his home for the next 34 years, not because he loved Brazil, but because Brazil had no extradition treaty with Britain for crimes like robbery. Once in Brazil, Biggs was legally beyond British reach. British police knew where he was. He eventually made no secret of his location, but they could not force Brazil to return him. Biggs's life in Brazil became bizarre and eventually sad. Initially, he lived quietly, trying to avoid attention, but as years passed and it became clear British authorities could not touch him, he became more open about his identity. He gave press interviews, sold his story to newspapers and television, became a minor celebrity in Brazil, where the British train robbery was seen as a romantic caper rather than a serious crime. He lived in Rio de Janeiro. In modest circumstances, the money from his share of the robbery had long since been spent, and he supported himself partly through selling his story and partly through donations from British tourists who visited him for the novelty of meeting a famous fugitive. He drank heavily, had relationships, fathered children, including a son with a Brazilian woman, which gave Biggs another layer of protection from extradition, since he was now the father of a Brazilian citizen. As decades passed, Biggs became a curiosity, a living relic of the 1960s, a man who had been young during the robbery but was growing old in exile. He expressed no remorse for the robbery, defended his actions, maintained that he deserved to be free. But his life was constricted. He could never leave Brazil, could never return to Britain even to visit dying relatives, was trapped in a country where he was famous but not free in any meaningful sense. Meanwhile, in Britain, the other train robbers were slowly being released from prison as they completed their sentences or were granted parole. The sentences, while harsh, were gradually reduced through parole and good behavior provisions. Men who had been sentenced to 30 years often served 12 to 15 years before release. Charlie Wilson, after his escape and recapture, served additional time for the escape itself, finally being released in 1978. He attempted to build a legitimate life, but struggled. In 1990, he was shot and killed at his home in Spain, murdered in circumstances that remain unclear, but were possibly connected to criminal activities he had returned to after prison. Gordon Goody served 12 years of his 30-year sentence before being released on parole in 1975. He moved to Spain, where he lived quietly, working various jobs, staying out of further trouble with the law. Tommy Wisby, Roy James, and the other gang members were similarly released after serving substantial portions of their sentences. Some managed to build new lives. Others struggled with the stigma of their convictions, the difficulty of finding employment, the temptation to return to crime. Several died relatively young, lives shortened perhaps by the stress of prison, by unhealthy lifestyles, by the consequences of choices made decades earlier. Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards, who had evaded capture for years after the robbery, were finally arrested. Reynolds in 1968 in England, Edwards in 1966 after returning from Mexico. Both were tried, convicted, and sentenced to substantial prison terms, though shorter than the original defendants, since they had not been convicted with the others, and some of the public and judicial fervour had diminished by the time of their trials. Jack Mills, the train driver who had been struck during the robbery, never fully recovered from his injuries. He suffered headaches, neurological problems, and psychological trauma. He attempted to return to work but found he could not perform his duties. He retired on medical disability, living on a reduced pension, his life diminished by those few seconds of violence on the night of August 8, 1963. He died in 1970, age 64, his death attributed at least partly to the long-term effects of the head injury. His family believed the robbery had killed him, just more slowly than if the blow had been immediately fatal. Mills became the forgotten victim of the Great Train Robbery. While the robbers became celebrities, giving interviews, selling their stories, being treated as clever rogues, Mills lived quietly with his pain, his reduced circumstances, and the knowledge that the men who had hurt him were famous while he was forgotten. His story is a reminder that crime has real victims, that violence has lasting consequences, that the romantic image of the daring robbery conceals the human cost. The money was never fully recovered. Of the £2,600,000 stolen, police recovered only about £350,000. The rest disappeared into hiding places, into foreign bank accounts, into purchases and investments that could not be traced. Some may have been spent quickly and carelessly. Some may remain hidden even now, buried or concealed in places known only to dead men. The money's disappearance became part of the legend that somewhere, millions of pounds from the Great Train Robbery still exist, waiting to be found. By the 1990s, most of the train robbers were dead or elderly. Their great crime, a half-century in the past, Britain transformed beyond recognition from the country of 1963. The case remained famous, referenced in popular culture, the subject of books and films, a touchstone for discussing crime and punishment and class and justice. And then, in 2001, Ronnie Biggs, after 36 years in Brazil, decided to return to Britain. He was 71 years old, in failing health, suffering from the effects of multiple strokes. He no longer faced justice. He sought medical care that Britain's National Health Service would provide and that he could not afford in Brazil. He returned voluntarily, knowing he would be arrested immediately and would spend his final years in prison. He was arrested at Heathrow Airport, returned to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. His health continued to deteriorate. He suffered more strokes, lost the ability to speak, became severely disabled. Pressure mounted to release him on compassionate grounds, given his age and health. The government resisted. He was a convicted criminal who had escaped prison and lived free for decades. Why should he receive mercy? Finally, in 2009, Biggs was released on compassionate grounds. He lived in a nursing home, unable to speak, paralyzed by strokes, his great adventure long over, his life reduced to the daily routines of care for an elderly invalid. He died in December 2013, age 84, having outlived most of his fellow robbers, having achieved fame but at the cost of decades of exile and a diminished final chapter. His death marked essentially the end of the great train robbery story as a living memory. Most participants were dead. The few survivors were elderly, no longer resembling the vigorous young men who had stopped a train on an August night in 1963. The world they had inhabited, working-class London of the 60s, the criminal underworld of that era, the Britain they had known was long gone, transformed by social change, economic development, cultural evolution. What remained was the legend, the story, the continuing fascination with how 15 men had stopped a train, stolen a fortune, and changed criminal history. And that legend, like all legends, tells us as much about ourselves, about what we find fascinating, what we choose to remember and forget, what we celebrate and condemn, as it does about the actual events of 50 years ago. Let's understand what life was like for those who escaped or avoided capture, because the popular image of fugitives living in luxury on stolen money bears little resemblance to reality. Most of the train robbers who became fugitives lived constrained, anxious lives, always looking over their shoulders, never truly free despite being out of prison. Imagine the reality of fugitive life. Picture Ronnie Biggs in Australia in the late 1960s. He's escaped from Wandsworth Prison, made his way to Australia with his wife and children, living under a false name. On the surface, it might seem like success, freedom, a new life, sunshine and beaches. But look closer. He can never relax, can never be himself. He's always the new identity, always maintaining a false history, always careful about what he says, who he talks to, what questions he answers. His children are growing up knowing their father is hiding, knowing they must keep secrets, knowing their family is different in ways they can't discuss with friends or teachers. He can't work normally, can't build a career using his real skills or experience because that might attract attention. He takes menial jobs, work that doesn't require documentation or references that might expose him. The money from the robbery, his share was modest, and much of it went to financing the escape runs out eventually. He's not living in luxury. He's living in constant, grinding anxiety about discovery. And he's cut off from everything he knew. His friends in London are mostly in prison or dead or distanced themselves. His family, parents, siblings, relatives are in England, inaccessible. He can't visit, can barely communicate. Special occasions, family events, crises, he's absent from all of it. The price of freedom is disconnection from everything that made life meaningful. Eventually, Australia becomes too risky. Police are closing in. Biggs flees to Brazil, where British extradition laws don't apply. But Brazil is foreign in ways Australia wasn't. Different language, different culture, harder to blend in. He's even more isolated, even more dependent on constantly maintaining his false identity. The years pass. Biggs watches himself age in mirrors, watches the world change through newspapers and television, watches Britain transform from the nation he knew in 1963 into something different, and he can never go back. Even when he wants to, even when the isolation becomes unbearable, he can't return without facing arrest and decades in prison. He becomes famous, paradoxically. The media loves the story of the escaped train robber. He gives interviews, sells his story, becomes a minor celebrity. But this fame is hollow. He's famous for being a fugitive, for being unavailable, for representing something criminal defiance, maybe, or romantic adventure that has little to do with who he actually is or how he actually lives. Other fugitives have similar stories. Charlie Wilson, another escapee, flees to Canada, then Mexico. He's murdered in 1990, shot at his villa in Spain, possibly by criminals he owed money to, possibly by people connected to the robbery. His freedom lasted nearly 30 years, but ended violently, senselessly, his death barely noticed by a public that had moved on from caring about aging train robbers. Buster Edwards, who didn't escape prison but was released after serving 9 years, tries to build a normal life afterward. He opens a flower stall near Waterloo Station, honest work, far removed from crime. But the notoriety follows him. People recognize him, want to talk about the robbery, treat him as a curiosity rather than a person. He suffers from depression, struggles with the weight of his past. In 1994, he hangs himself. The money from the robbery is long gone. The celebrity means nothing. What remains is guilt, regret, and mental anguish that makes life unbearable. This is the reality of criminal fugitives. The movies show glamour and freedom. The reality is isolation, anxiety, disconnection, and lives constrained in ways that make prison seem simple by comparison. At least in prison, you know the rules, know your release date, maintain some connection to family and friends. As a fugitive, you have none of that. Just endless hiding, endless pretending, endless waiting for discovery that will eventually come. The train robbery made some men fugitives, but it didn't make them free. The Great Train Robbery of 1963 was a watershed moment in British criminal history and in public consciousness about crime, security, and justice. Its legacy extended far beyond the immediate crime and punishment, influencing security practices, criminal behavior, media coverage of crime, and public attitudes toward criminals and the justice system. The most immediate and practical legacy was the complete transformation of how valuable cargo was transported in Britain. The robbery demonstrated vulnerabilities that the banking and postal systems had not seriously considered. Mail trains had operated with minimal security for decades, protected only by locks and the assumption that stopping a moving train and robbing it was too difficult to attempt. That assumption was now proven false. Within months of the robbery, security protocols changed dramatically. Cash transportation on trains was either eliminated or heavily secured with armed guards, reinforced coaches, and electronic monitoring systems. The high-value mail coach concept was phased out in favor of other methods of moving cash between banks. Armored vehicles became the standard for transporting large amounts of currency. These vehicles were designed to resist attack, equipped with alarms and communication systems, staffed by trained security personnel. Bank security in general was enhanced. The robbery demonstrated that the movement of cash was the vulnerable point in the banking system. Banks responded by reducing the physical movement of currency, increasing electronic transfers, and when physical transfer was necessary, surrounding it with layers of security. Railway security was tightened. Signal systems were redesigned to make tampering more difficult. Train crews were given better communication equipment. Routes carrying valuable cargo were monitored more closely. The changes extended beyond the specific vulnerabilities exploited in the train robbery. The event prompted a general reassessment of security across all aspects of commerce and finance. If 15 men could steal £2.5 million from a moving train, what else was vulnerable? This question led to enhanced security in many industries and contexts. The Great Train Robbery also influenced criminal behavior, though perhaps not in the way authorities hoped. Rather than deterring major crime, the robbery and the celebrity it brought, the criminals demonstrated to other would-be criminals that spectacular crimes could bring not just financial reward but fame. The 1960s and 70s saw an increase in large-scale planned robberies in Britain. Criminals attempted similar operations, stopping trains, robbing banks with military precision, executing complex heists that required planning and organization. Not all of these were successful, and improved security made such crimes increasingly difficult. But the robbery had demonstrated what was possible, and some criminals were inspired to attempt similar feats. The professionalization of crime accelerated. The train robbery required specialized knowledge, careful planning, and coordinated teamwork. It showed that criminal enterprises organized like military operations could succeed where opportunistic crime might fail. This lesson was not lost on the criminal underworld, which increasingly organized itself along more sophisticated lines. Simultaneously, the harsh sentences imposed on the train robbers sent a message to criminals about the consequences of major crime. 30 years in prison was a severe deterrent, and some potential criminals undoubtedly reconsidered their plans, knowing that capture would mean decades of imprisonment. Whether this deterrence was effective overall is impossible to measure. We cannot know how many crimes were prevented by the threat of such sentences, but the possibility of long imprisonment certainly factored into criminal calculations. The Great Train Robbery had an enormous impact on how crime was portrayed in media and popular culture. Prior to the robbery, criminals in British culture were generally portrayed as either violent thugs or seedy underworld figures. The train robbers, however, were different. They were working-class men who had executed a crime that required intelligence, planning, and courage, however misdirected. The media coverage reflected this ambiguity. Newspapers reported the crime with a mixture of condemnation and fascination. The robbers were criminals, certainly, but they were also portrayed as clever, audacious, almost admirable in their planning and execution. This ambivalence reflected broader class tensions in British society. The train robbers were working-class criminals who had stolen from institutions, banks, the postal service, that many working-class people viewed with suspicion or resentment. Films and books about the robbery proliferated. Some portrayed the robbers sympathetically, as working-class heroes striking back against an unjust system. Others emphasized the crime's impact on victims like Jack Mills, questioning the romantic image of the daring robbery. Both approaches kept the robbery in public consciousness, ensuring it remained a cultural reference point. The celebrity status achieved by some gang members, particularly Ronnie Biggs, troubled many observers. Here was a convicted criminal who had escaped justice, living openly in Brazil, giving interviews, selling his story, making money from his crimes. This seemed to mock the justice system and to send a message that crime could pay if you were clever enough to avoid the consequences. But Biggs's celebrity also illustrated something else, that fame is not the same as success or happiness. His life in Brazil was constrained and ultimately sad. He could never return home, could never see family and friends, was trapped in a country where he was a curiosity but not truly free. His eventual return to Britain, broken by age and illness, demonstrated that escape is not the same as freedom. The Great Train Robbery raised enduring questions about justice, particularly regarding the proportionality of punishment. Were 30-year sentences for robbery, however audacious, appropriate? This question has been debated for decades, with no clear consensus. Those who defended the sentences argued that the crime was exceptionally serious, involving careful planning, organization of many participants, stopping a train through force, and theft of an enormous sum. The violence against Jack Mills, even though limited to a single blow, caused lasting harm and elevated the moral seriousness of the crime. Deterrence required harsh sentences to prevent copycat crimes and to demonstrate that society would punish spectacular criminality with spectacular consequences. The criminals had chosen their course knowing the risks, and sympathy for them ignored their choice to commit serious crime. Those who criticized the sentences as excessive argued that 30 years was disproportionate compared to sentences for many violent crimes, including some murders. The punishment seemed to value property over human life. The class bias was evident. White-collar criminals who stole comparable or larger amounts through fraud received much lighter sentences. The train robbers were being punished more harshly because they were working class and because their crime was public and embarrassing to authorities. Long sentences do not effectively deter crime, as criminological research has shown. Certainty of punishment deters more effectively than severity of punishment. The sentences destroyed families and turned men who might have been rehabilitated into hardened criminals or broken individuals. These competing views reflect different philosophies of criminal justice. Should punishment focus on retribution, making criminals suffer for their crimes, deterrence, preventing future crime through threat of punishment, rehabilitation, reforming criminals so they can return to society, or incapacitation, removing dangerous individuals from society? The train robbery sentences emphasized retribution and deterrence while largely ignoring rehabilitation, reflecting the punitive approach dominant in the 1960s. Modern criminal justice thinking has shifted somewhat toward rehabilitation and away from purely punitive approaches, though debates continue about the proper balance. The train robbery sentences are often cited in these debates as an example of excessive punitiveness, though others continue to defend them as appropriate given the crime's seriousness. Jack Mills's story deserves particular emphasis because it is often overlooked in the romantic narratives about the robbery. Mills was a working-class man like the robbers, a train driver doing his job, supporting his family, harming no one. The blow to his head during the robbery caused lasting injury, physical pain, neurological damage, psychological trauma. He could not return to the job he loved. He lived on reduced income. His health deteriorated. Mills died 7 years after the robbery, his family believing the injury contributed to his premature death. Yet while the robbers became celebrities, Mills remained largely forgotten by the public. His story received little media attention compared to the endless coverage of the criminals. There were no films dramatizing his suffering, no books telling his story, no public recognition of what he had endured. This imbalance reflects something troubling about how we engage with crime narratives. The criminals were interesting, their planning, their daring, their escapes, their celebrity. The victim was ordinary, a working man who suffered and died without drama or spectacle. But Mills's ordinariness is precisely what makes his story important. He represents the real cost of crime, the unspectacular but profound harm that criminal violence inflicts on innocent people. Any assessment of the Great Train Robbery must grapple with Mills's injury and death. The robbery was not a victimless crime, not a clever caper without consequences. Real harm was done to a real person whose life was diminished by the violence of men seeking money they had not earned. The fate of the stolen money remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Over £2 million was never recovered. Where did it go? Some was certainly spent quickly by gang members before their arrest on luxury items, on establishing false identities, on escaping abroad. The lifestyle some gang members briefly enjoyed between the robbery and their arrests required substantial expenditure. Some was hidden and later recovered by gang members after their release from prison. There were persistent rumors that certain participants retrieved hidden caches of money years later. Though proving this was impossible by the time they were released, the serial numbers of the notes were no longer being tracked, and the money could be spent or laundered without detection. Some may have been lost or destroyed. Money hidden in outdoor locations might have been damaged by weather, discovered by accident and kept by finders, or simply lost when the person who hid it died without revealing the location. Some probably went to accomplices who helped with the robbery or the aftermath. The people who provided hideouts, false identities, plastic surgery, transportation. These individuals were never caught or identified, and they presumably kept whatever they were paid. The incompleteness of the recovery illustrates an important truth about property crimes. Even when criminals are caught and punished, the stolen property often cannot be recovered. The money the train robbers stole was gone, spent, hidden, dispersed beyond recovery. The banks and postal service absorbed the loss. Justice in terms of punishment was achieved, but justice in terms of restoration was impossible. The Great Train Robbery occurred at a specific moment in technological and social history, and changes in both technology and society have made similar crimes increasingly difficult. Technologically, the growth of electronic banking has reduced the need to physically move large amounts of cash. Most financial transactions now occur electronically, as numbers in computer systems rather than as physical currency. This eliminates the vulnerability that the train robbers exploited the movement of physical money between locations. Security technology has advanced enormously. GPS tracking, electronic monitoring, digital surveillance, biometric identification, sophisticated alarm systems. All of these make it much harder to commit major property crimes without being detected and identified. The train robbers succeeded, partly because forensic technology in 1963 was limited. Today's forensic capabilities, DNA analysis, digital forensics, comprehensive databases, make it far more difficult to commit major crimes without leaving identifying evidence. Socially, Britain has changed in ways that make the cultural context of the robbery seem distant. The rigid class divisions of the 1960s have softened, though not disappeared. Working class identity has evolved. The criminal underworld that produced the train robbers' tightly knit communities where criminal activity was semi-tolerated and criminal honor was valued has been disrupted by social mobility, urban redevelopment, and changing values. These changes mean that another great train robbery is unlikely, not just because security has improved, but because the social world that produced the original robbery no longer exists in the same form. Why does the Great Train Robbery continue to fascinate people more than 6 decades after it occurred? Several factors explain its enduring hold on public imagination. Scale and audacity. The robbery was spectacular in a way that most crimes are not. Stopping a moving train, stealing millions, evading capture, at least temporarily, this was crime as grand theatre. The planning, the months of preparation, the attention to detail, the assembly of a team with specific skills, this appeals to our fascination with how complex operations are organized and executed. The human drama, the stories of individual gang members, Reynolds's planning, Biggs's escape, and decades in Brazil, the various fates of the others, provide ongoing narrative interest. Class dynamics. The robbery was committed by working-class men against institutions representing authority and wealth. This resonates with class consciousness, and with a certain working-class pride in getting one over on the establishment. The mystery, the unrecovered money, the unidentified participants, the questions that remain unanswered, these provide ongoing grounds for speculation and investigation. Moral ambiguity. Unlike crimes involving murder or sexual violence, robbery of money from institutions creates moral ambiguity. The victims were banks and the postal service, not sympathetic individuals. Mills's injury complicates this, but he is often forgotten. This makes it easier to view the robbers with a certain ambivalence. Nostalgia. For some, particularly in Britain, the robbery represents a certain era, the 1960s, the last gasp of a certain kind of working-class culture, a time before modern surveillance and security made such crimes nearly impossible. There is nostalgia for this era. Problematic as that nostalgia might be, the continuing interest in the robbery has produced numerous books, multiple films, television documentaries, and endless newspaper articles on anniversaries of the crime. Each generation reinterprets the story according to its own concerns and values, finding in the robbery whatever resonates with contemporary issues. In the end, what can we conclude about the Great Train Robbery? It was a crime, a serious crime that involved violence, theft, and lasting harm to an innocent victim. The perpetrators were criminals who deserved punishment. This cannot be forgotten or minimized in the face of the robbery's spectacular nature or the subsequent celebrity of some participants. But it was also a historical event that reveals much about its time and place, about class in 1960s, Britain, about the state of security and technology, about criminal subcultures, about media and popular culture, about justice and its complexities. The robbery succeeded because of meticulous planning, yet failed because of careless mistakes. The criminals achieved their goal of stealing a fortune, yet almost all were caught and punished. Some escaped for years, yet their escapes brought not freedom, but exile and constrained lives. The stolen money was never fully recovered, yet most of it was likely spent or lost, rather than bringing lasting benefit to those who stole it. The harsh sentences imposed on the robbers sparked debate about justice and proportionality that continues today. Were the sentences appropriate or excessive? The question has no objectively correct answer. It depends on your philosophy of punishment, your views on class and justice, your assessment of how seriously property crime should be treated compared to violent crime. Jack Mills, the injured train driver, paid a price for the robbery's violence that continued until his death. His story is the necessary counterweight to any romantic view of the crime, a reminder that crime has real victims who suffer real harm. The Great Train Robbery was a moment when careful planning met human fallibility, when criminal ambition met the methodical machinery of justice, when spectacular crime met public fascination. It was, in its way, a perfect crime, imperfectly executed, brilliant in conception, successful in execution, doomed by carelessness, remembered far beyond its historical importance, because it captured imaginations and raised questions that each generation must answer for itself about crime, punishment, and justice. We have traced the Great Train Robbery from its planning through its execution, investigation, trial, aftermath, and lasting legacy. We have seen how 15 men stopped a train on an August night in 1963, stole a fortune, and sparked events that would unfold for decades. The robbery succeeded in its immediate goal. The gang escaped with over £2.5 million, an enormous sum that represented the largest cash theft in British history at that time. But the success was temporary. The carelessness at Leatherslade farm, the fingerprints left throughout the property, the vehicles that could be traced, these mistakes undid months of careful planning. The investigation demonstrated the power of methodical police work and forensic science. The fingerprint evidence was overwhelming, the detective work thorough, the arrests swift, once the evidence pointed to specific individuals. The success of the investigation showed that even spectacular crimes leave evidence, and patient, professional police work can unravel even carefully planned operations. The trials and sentences reflected the attitudes of their time toward crime and punishment. The severity of the sentences, 30 years for robbery, shocked many and sparked debates about proportionality that continue to this day. Whether those sentences were just or excessive depends on values and philosophies that different people will always assess differently. The escapes, particularly Ronnie Biggs's flight to Brazil and decades as a fugitive, added another dramatic chapter to the story. But Biggs's life in exile, while free from prison, was not really free. He was trapped, unable to return home, reduced to selling his story for money, his great adventure ultimately bringing not wealth or happiness, but a constrained, diminished existence. The legacy of the robbery extended far beyond the immediate participants. Security practices were transformed, making similar crimes far more difficult. The media's treatment of the robbers influenced how crime would be covered for decades. The questions raised about justice and punishment remain relevant to contemporary debates about criminal justice. Jack Mills, the injured train driver, deserves the final word in any accounting of the robbery. His injury, his suffering, his diminished life, and early death, these represent the cost of the crime beyond the stolen money. Mills was doing his job, harming no one, when violence was inflicted on him. His story is essential to understanding that crime is not just about money or planning or daring. It is about harm done to real people, consequences that extend far beyond the immediate crime. The Great Train Robbery occupies a unique place in British criminal history. It was not the most violent crime, not the most lucrative in the long run, not unique in its basic elements, but it was distinctive in its scale, its audacity, the celebrity it brought the criminals, and the debates it sparked about crime and justice. More than 6 decades later, the robbery remains a reference point, a story that continues to be told and retold, each telling revealing something about the teller's values and the age in which the telling occurs. For some, it represents working-class audacity and cleverness. For others, it represents criminality that deserved harsh punishment. For still others, it represents questions about proportionality, class, and justice that remain unresolved. The night of August 7th to 8th, 1963, was a moment when planning, opportunity, and criminal ambition converged. 15 men stopped a train, altered many lives, and created a story that would endure far longer than any of them probably imagined. The money is mostly gone, the participants are almost all dead. The Britain of 1963 is transformed beyond recognition. But the story remains a tale of crime and punishment, of planning and mistakes, of celebrity and suffering, of questions that each generation must answer for itself. The train that stopped on that August night was just a mail train, making a routine run from Glasgow to London. But the stopping of that train became a historical event, a cultural touchstone, a story that reveals truths about human ambition, the nature of crime, the machinery of justice, and the complex ways we remember and interpret the past. We've journeyed from the planning stages months before August 1963 to that night beside the railway tracks, through the chaotic aftermath and the decades of consequences. We've met the robbers Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, Buster Edwards, the market trader, Gordon Goody, the hairdresser turned criminal, and a dozen others who thought they could pull off the perfect crime. We've understood how they did it, why they got caught, what happened to them afterward. The great train robbery was brilliant in execution but disastrous in consequence. The robbery itself worked almost perfectly. The train was stopped, the money taken, the gang escaped. But what came after destroyed them. The violence against Jack Mills turned public opinion against them. The evidence at Leatherslade farm made arrests inevitable. The harsh sentences ended lives and broke families. The escapes and years as fugitives brought no happiness, only exile and constant fear of discovery. And the money? Most of it was never recovered. Some was spent quickly and foolishly. Some was hidden and never retrieved. Some was recovered by police. But the bulk, perhaps half of the original £2.5 million, simply vanished. Probably burned, possibly still hidden somewhere, certainly lost to those who stole it. The great irony is that most of the robbers got little lasting benefit from the fortune they risked everything to steal. The robbery teaches us about ambition and consequence, about how meticulous planning means nothing if followed by careless mistakes, about how violence, even momentary violence, can transform a crime from daring to despicable, about how prison sentences, however harsh, cannot undo harm or restore what was taken, about how criminal celebrity, the folk hero status some robbers achieved, masks the real costs of crime. Victims like Jack Mills who suffer lasting harm, families broken by imprisonment, lives wasted in exile or in cells. Jack Mills never recovered from the blow to his head. He tried to return to work but couldn't manage it. He died in 1970, 7 years after the robbery, with many believing the injury hastened his death. His family received no compensation adequate to their loss. The money paid for Mills's suffering mostly ended up in police evidence rooms, or burned in criminals' fireplaces, or buried in locations forgotten by men who died in prison. The story continues to fascinate because it seems to contain everything. Brilliant planning, dramatic execution, immediate success followed by slow-motion disaster. It's a morality play, dressed as a crime story, vice punished, but not before achieving temporary triumph, virtue suffering but ultimately prevailing. And it's a very British story, revealing much about class, about celebrity, about how society responds to spectacular crime, about the complex relationship between law and justice. The train that stopped on August 8th, 1963, was just a mail train making a routine run from Glasgow to London. The men who stopped it were just criminals attempting a robbery. But somehow that stopping became history, became legend, became a story that would be told and retold for decades, capturing something about human ambition, human fallibility, and the often surprising consequences of our choices. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Britain's most famous crimes. I hope this exploration of the Great Train Robbery from planning through execution to aftermath has brought both understanding and contemplation to your evening. Good night.